Just months after Pearl Harbor, air raids sounded in LA. Was it another Japanese attack? Some reported seeing enemy planes in the sky. Others saw just one large object. Others saw strange lights. And some saw nothing at all. But whatever it was, the military had a shootout. Huge spotlights aimed at whatever their target was. Speculation has always been that this Battle of LA wasn't a war with Japan, but actually a war with a UFO. So what happened that fateful night in February of 1942? What does remote viewing data tell us about that event? Join Metaphysical for a show that's out of this world. John, how you doing?
Good.
All
The
right.
Battle of LA, we finally get to it. One of those historical events that is so documented in the public that something happened.
This instance that we have is really interesting because of the data around it. Just in December 7th of 1941, we had the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? So we're just talking about months after that. February 24th, 1942 was the start of the Battle of LA. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Japanese were probing the coastline of the United States because they were looking for areas that didn't have good radar coverage. They actually did attack. I mean, they attacked the Goleta oil fields, like near Santa Barbara. They attacked the mouth of the Columbia River up in Washington, Oregon. And then they had that plan to drop incendiary devices via balloons in the Pacific Northwest to catch the forest on fire. And their intent was to draw the U.S. fleet, the Pacific fleet, U.S. Pacific fleet, to the coast of California so that we would get out of their hair in all the other islands out there where they were fighting.
And then it makes sense that the naval intelligence at that time instructed California coastal units to prep for a Japanese attack on the evening of February 24th. So this looks like Pearl Harbor too. I mean, we're gonna get hit again
Yeah,
with
like the
another Japanese.
beginning of Pearl Harbor too, right?
Right. And so it's 2 a.m., February 25th. Military radar picked up enemy contact 120 miles west of LA. And so this is when the air raid siren sounded and a citywide blackout was put into effect. Now, if it was a citywide blackout and they started firing hundreds of ammunition into the sky, you can imagine what that would look like in LA. Like, that's all you'd see. Crazy stuff flying into the sky, right?
Right. I mean, given, LA wasn't as built up, obviously, back then. I mean, a lot of like empty rural land away from the coast.
Yeah, and it wasn't the lights from the ammunition. They were shooting searchlights into the sky. These are anti-aircraft guns. They were manning anti-aircraft guns, but they were sweeping the skies with searchlights. And there's a really famous, like, this is just almost an unbelievable image. This looks
Right.
straight out of the Twilight Zone.
I did come across some story on that in that the newspaper did some heavy duty airbrushing on it as well.
It looks like there's a little UFO in the middle. You see that?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, can you imagine waking up to this where it's just shrapnels flying everywhere? Because that's flak in the air, and so flak is one of those things where it explodes in the air and just launches fragments everywhere. And so this stuff's like going off all over the place. I just wonder how many people were injured by the shrapnel, by the flak falling down on top of them.
Yeah, or their homes must have been, I mean, who knows? Buildings totally must have gotten nailed by this shrapnel. And it was at 3 a.m. that an unidentified object was seen in the skies. Troops in Santa Monica unleashed anti-aircraft and 50 caliber machine gun fire. Coastal defense weapons joined in the shooting. Quote, powerful searchlights from countless stations stabbed the sky with brilliant, probing fingers, the LA Times wrote, while anti aircraft batteries dotted the heavens with beautiful, if sinister, orange bursts of shrapnel. I leave it to the LA Times.
You know, when you think about it, like we're outside of that, like the idea of war on the United States, and back then, like there were these bunkers, anti-aircraft bunkers and whatnot, all up and down the coast. And you can go today to find these old bunkers that are just like collapsed in and whatnot, which is a really interesting thing to do because it's like it's really interesting to think that literally these things were lining the coast.
And we have some quotes from some people that were there. Quote, I could barely see the planes, but they were up there all right, a coastal artillery man named Charles Patrick later wrote in a letter. I could see 6 planes, and shells were bursting all around them. Naturally, all of us fellows were anxious to get our 2 cents worth in. And when the command came, everybody cheered like a son of a gun. Yeah, this barrage eventually continued for over an hour. By the time a final all clear order was given later that morning, Los Angeles artillery batteries had pumped over 1,400 rounds of anti aircraft ammunition into the sky. That's a lot. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
right. You know, the way the Japanese would do it is that they would bring submarines over with planes on the submarine, and they'd launch the planes from the submarine once the submarine surfaced. They were very skittish about Los Angeles in general, and that's why they were going north. That's why they were probing areas where there was no radar, and they knew that there was going to be massive amounts of radar around the big metropolitan areas. The guy says he saw 6 planes, right? He saw 6 planes that he was firing at, which is a curious thing because I don't think the Japanese would have gone the route of attacking LA in general, right? Because of the radar spread and them staying away from it. They're not going to get through that radar.
Well, and it makes more sense for them to try to, attack Hawaii, right? Attack Pearl Harbor. It's further away. Really, has anyone ever tried or dared try to attack America on the homeland? Like, it's such a monstrous country. Like, what do? You attack
Right.
one little area, you conquer an area, and what happens? Like, you get surrounded by, like unlimited forces coming in to protect that area. But there was other other weird phenomena. Mysterious flares had been seen shooting up from the Angeles National Forest, which sent federal forest ranger Pat Harlan on a 12-hour search of the area without results. That's strange. Shortly before dawn, he thought he saw a star falling through the sky back over the mountains and wondered if that's why the reports about mysterious flares came in. During the Battle of LA, a number of people reported seeing something that looked like a giant butterfly. It might have been a blimp. Those are weird. That's weird.
They're weird accounts, right?
Yes. Like that's clearly not a World War II plane or World War I plane, whatever. World War
No,
II
it's
in this
not.
case. Yeah, okay. So the next day, people didn't realize that the air raids, the rules were still in effect since it wasn't nighttime anymore. So streetcars weren't allowed to run, which thousands of people didn't know when they started driving to work and were stopped by police. So this air raid was like several hours. I mean, we're talking about the whole night into the morning. The railways weren't allowed to transport people either, and hundreds of workers walked to their jobs instead, but thousands were late for work. The all clear signal was given at 7:25 a.m. More than 1,000 telephone calls an hour were received by a streetcar company from passengers wanting to know why the cars were not running or where the streetcars were. Early morning deliveries of milk and newspapers were halted until after the all clear. 14 blackout babies were born in LA during the shootout itself. The hospitals were equipped with blackout safety lighting for emergencies. Now, why keep the air raid going until 7:25 a.m. or whatever it was? Like, if the thing had been cleared from the sky and you were sure that the Japanese were not or were attacking, this is where it gets interesting. A few documents were said to have been leaked to a UFO researcher, Tim Cook, not Apple's Tim Cook, obviously. One was from FDR to the chief of staff of the Army, and that would have been George C. Marshall at the time, 2 days after the Battle of LA took place. So this image is just a retyped image of what the memo may have looked like, it allegedly said. They don't have these physical copies of these documents in hand. This is from FDR. I have considered the disposition of the material in possession of the Army that may be of great significance toward the development of a super weapon of war. I disagree with the argument that such information should be shared with our ally, the Soviet Union. Consultation with Dr. Bush and other scientists on the issue of finding practical uses for the atomic secrets learned from study of celestial devices precludes any further discussion, and I therefore authorize Dr. Bush to proceed with the project without further delay. This information is vital to the nation's superiority and must remain within the confines of state secrets. Any further discussion on the matter will be restricted to General Donovan, Dr. Bush, the Secretary of War, and yourself. The challenge our nation faces is daunting and perilous in this undertaking, and I have committed the resources of the government toward that end. You have my assurance that when circumstances are favorable, and we are victorious, the Army will have the fruits of research in exploring further applications of this new wonder. You may speak to me about this if the above is not wholly clear. FDR.
I have considered the disposition of the material in possession of the Army. So the material is of great significance toward the development of a super weapon of war. That's interesting. Well, Vannevar Bush was heavily involved in classified projects, obviously.
There are like a load of bushes leading up to the president's.
Right, but the Bushes that were presidents here were not related to this Dr. Bush.
Oh, really? These
Yeah.
are not. It's not a direct lineage.
No, no.
Interesting.
Not, I mean, as far as I know, because I've done a little research on that to try to understand it. But he was, the lore under the surface is that he was heavily involved with Einstein and perhaps even edges of Oppenheimer, heavily involved with them in classified projects regarding what was retrieved, for instance, at Roswell. It likely is the case that he would be, since his position was pretty high. So it's interesting that this would be a public statement, basically alluding to getting something celestial
Yeah,
that can be used as a super weapon.
a super weapon. Okay, so another document was allegedly leaked dated March 5th, 1942, and this is from George C. Marshall to the president. So this is almost like this is a reply, it seems. Quote, regarding the air raid over Los Angeles, it was learned by Army G2 that Rear Admiral Anderson has informed the War Department of a naval recovery of an unidentified airplane off the coast of California with no bearing on conventional explanation. Further, it has been revealed that the Army Air Corps has also recovered a similar craft in the San Bernardino Mountains east of Los Angeles, which cannot be identified as conventional aircraft. This headquarters has come to the determination that the mystery airplanes are, in fact, not earthly, and according to secret intelligence sources, they are in all probability of interplanetary origin. As a consequence, I have issued orders to Army G2 that a special intelligence unit be created to further investigate the phenomena and report any significant connection between recent incidents and those collected by the director of the Office of Coordinator of Information, GC Marshall. Anyway, John, what do you think of that?
That's an interesting leak, if it's true. I never heard of this leak. It would back up the other FDR, yeah, statement, which is a curious thing. And back then, this is pre-Roswell. This stuff was somewhat new, so it was like I don't think people really knew what to do with this, and so there were not huge clampdowns on information flow like there are today. Actually, I mean, it isn't that there are huge clampdowns now. There's huge clampdowns on the military industrial complex side, but not on the people side. People are like way more open to this now than I've ever seen. It's actually quite incredible. It's like only showing one aspect of the phenomena. Like, and you'll understand what I mean when we get to the remote viewing data side. But it's only showing one aspect because this thing was way bigger than a mere UFO sighting. This thing ventured into the realm of high strangeness.
Well, why don't we get into it now? I feel like we've covered enough of the details. Were the Japanese actually involved in this firefight?
No, no, like
No.
the data on this did not have anything like that. Nothing like that at all. There was, and just also from the logical side and how the Japanese were approaching the attack on the mainland, they were afraid of the radar systems that the US had. Very afraid of it. And that's why they were constantly like going up and down the coast probing, and they would have known there was overlapping radar all around from, LA all the way down to San Diego because the military assets in the area are huge for the United States in that area, the whole area, deep sea ports, etc. So they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have attacked. And the data indicates that it was nothing to do with Japan.
So then what were they shooting 1,400 rounds of artillery at in the sky?
Yeah, all right. How do I approach this? This is a complicated one. Okay, so we all know about radar. Think about Montauk. Think about the Philadelphia experiment.
So when you talk about radar too, you're not just talking about what people commonly understand as radar, you're talking about frequencies, right?
Frequencies and unified field theory. You're talking about a standing wave, right? A standing wave. So in frequencies, when frequencies are moving together, they can be tuned into a standing wave, right? Where you have a disturbance in that field, where the field like coalesces into one wave, right, from different sources. And so, like with Montauk, for instance, you have that idea coming forth in the data. And people have talked about this where they were using microwave and radar in order to pulse different frequencies to create that standing wave, which opens the doorway. Then you have the Philadelphia experiment, where one of the thoughts and ideas around it is that they used radar for that as well in order to make that ship disappear. That technology supposedly made its way to Montauk in the development of that program, right? But the Philadelphia experiment, that happened just a year later, right? That happened a year later from the Battle of LA in 1943. The data on this goes the path of talking about a standing wave caused by frequencies, most likely radar. Now, think about 1942 LA. This was the birth of radar in a sense. They'd known about it. Theoretical, it had been there for a while. They knew that you could bounce radar frequency, you can bounce radio signals off of objects and read them. The thing is that they may not have known exactly the power of these waves, especially when you have a ton of overlapping radar systems. On top of that, experimentation was already in process on what you can do with radar and creating a standing wave, because things had been seen in experiments that high strangeness would begin to occur. So what we have in LA, you have this event, a quantum event, where they created a standing wave through the frequencies, and it opened up doorway or doorways that literally traversed through time. So when you think of the Montauk experiment, what did they do according to remote viewing data? They used that standing wave in order to open a doorway into another world, right? The upside down. And this is part of a technology that we've seen with remote viewing that UFOs and advanced civilizations will use in order to disappear and reappear. It's kind of a cloaking technology. So it's like a portal. What happened in LA is that it was more widespread. It wasn't localized. It was more widespread. And what people were seeing, it traversed through time and space, time slips, dimensional disturbances where people literally could have been seeing things from the future in the sky, things from the past in the sky. So the butterfly, for instance, could have been a stealth bomber flying through the sky at a certain point of time, and these windows are opening up and disappearing, and they're seeing that go through the sky. It could have been anything of that sort, because in the data, it's going down the path of explaining these time rips that were occurring, literal time rips, and what people saw was stuff from other places and time. So the other side of this is that because of these electromagnetic standing waves that were created, if there were any exotic craft in the sky, their electromagnetic engines would get shut down, right? As in Roswell. So when we looked at Roswell, which happened in 1947, the radar pulses caused their electromagnetic propulsion systems to shut down, which caused them to crash. So the Battle of LA did include the UFO side. And that's why I believe the statement that FDR said and the other statement from, I think, the general, that they got hold of some of these craft because basically when this whole thing happened, it shut down their electromagnetic field. The craft crashed and they retrieved them. And this could have been one of the very first times that that particular thing happened. There was a lot of confusion, for one thing, because you've got flak everywhere, you've got explosions everywhere. People are claiming they're seeing all sorts of things that are flying around and disappearing and reappearing and whatnot, all of these different shapes. And so literally, like, they're seeing these like tears in reality that are even layered on top of each other through time, through dimension. So this thing turned into a very big high strangeness event, as opposed to what we normally think. Like, well, I'm going to go on the conspiracy side, and it was just a UFO they were shooting at because aliens flying. No, man, this went way crazier on the data side than just that. Like, it was literally almost like, feels like the birth of the ideas around what radar can ultimately do, right? Which led to a year later that Philadelphia experiment, which was where they, made the ship disappear in, I think, Norfolk, Virginia. Some people say that they lined it with high voltage cords, high voltage lines. Other people say radar was added to it. In my estimation, radar was added to it because of what we've seen and how that relates to Montauk and this even. So this is a really curious
Well,
thing.
radar would have been added too because they were trying to cloak a ship. They were trying to make a ship invisible.
Right. That's
Any
true.
which way. The goal was to develop technology in the Philadelphia experiment that would render a massive warship completely undetectable by enemy radar.
Right.
And so
Right.
the radar thing totally checks out for that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea of standing waves, frequency and standing waves as it relates to portals is nothing new either, because there are plenty of people, and we've seen it in our data, talk about sound frequencies even that have the ability to open a portal. Like with Aramu Muru down in near Lake Titicaca, the big false door where people claim that a certain sound will open up this dimensional portal. Interesting thing that I've been thinking a lot about in relation to this too is that a lot of people talk about how their animals, cat or dog, will kind of look to the corner of a room. They'll be staring at the corner of a room, and you're going, wait, is there something in the corner of the room? Okay, that's a really interesting thing, right? Because that's something that's somewhat pervasive. When you get to corners of rooms, and you're in a recording studio, for instance, sound engineers will have to put a baffle in the corner in order to absorb the sound, because the way sound works is that it bounces between the corners and creates a standing wave. And we know that the standing wave is the entry and exit in portal land. If they don't put a baffle where that standing wave is in the corner, it screws up the recordings.
So now we know what cats and dogs are like looking at or barking at when they're looking at the corner of the ceiling
Right.
of the room. Because the audio is bouncing off of that one area and creating Some type of an anomaly.
Right. So it's hitting the corners and coming together and hitting each other and creating just a standing waveform. Right. And that's what we see in remote viewing data. When you get that standing waveform through any kind of frequency, is where you have the potential to open a door to another world.
Wow.
Yeah.
So like what's so funny about this is like in LA during the Battle of LA, they could have been looking at any world, anything
Right.
through
Anything.
this portal. One thing though that I think people at home are going to have a question about, so I'm going to ask it is if it was so easy to create this in 1942, why haven't we seen these happening now when we have much more powerful radar and much more advanced technology? Like why doesn't this accidentally happen all the time, especially even with the layers upon layers of Wi-Fi and everything shooting all around us?
It could be. It could be. We just don't notice it. I know, and I don't think it's going to be powerful enough on the frequency side in order to do much to us, except more subtle things. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a good question though. It's a really good question.
I just wonder what was the recipe of radar, that created the anomaly in the sky at this time.
Right.
Like what made that day so different?
It looks like that there was like experimentation as well as accidents that were happening. It was like experimentation as well as accidents. So they could have been experimenting at the same time that this occurred, and that extra radar added to the whole anomaly. The extra radar for defenses could have added to the whole anomaly.
Right.
When we've looked at, for instance, we've looked at Gary McKinnon, who was the NASA hacker who got into their NASA computers and claimed he saw a photograph and an airbrushed photograph. And the photograph that was not airbrushed was of a large ship. When we looked at this ship, when we looked at what he saw and what that was, the ship, which was out in space, had these, how they use geodesic domes in radar? They'll put the radar behind the geodesic dome. This thing had a couple of these geodesic domes. And when we remote viewed it, they were not for the purpose of radar and to see what's coming. They were for the purpose of creating time and dimensional rifts. So this is something that we actually run across in other taskings where radar is involved in the manipulation of another dimension, going to another dimension, slipping just outside of ours into another one, and then coming back.
So these domes that they were putting over those radars actually had everything to do with creating these anomalies, these like strange phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so.
That's
These
so strange.
geodesic domes are very prevalent in coverings for radar dishes. And it's related to time a lot of times when we look at the more esoteric projects around this stuff.
This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit. Like I wonder if this can be recreated in your backyard, basically. I mean, the
Well,
technology is so much greater now, you know what I mean?
there was some guy who went on the Art Bell show. He was on there for a series, and he started to talk about how he was able to create a rift in time or a dimensional rift based off of electronics that he was working on, electromagnetism. And a lot of people believe this story. I don't think we've remote viewed it. I have to look back and see if we did, but he over the years would call in to Art Bell and talk about this thing that he was working on. So much so that Art Bell kind of pushed this whole crowdfunding thing for him. This guy actually got arrested for it, and so it's in the papers. Of the time, I think it was the 1990s or something. He was arrested because what happened was he pulled way too much power from the grid, which shut down the whole city, literally. And he got arrested for that. When the police came, he said, well, I was doing experiments with different dimensions and time, and we made the table disappear. And they're just like, this guy's insane. But he literally took out the whole city, right? And so he goes on the Art Bell show later and starts talking about this and his experiments with this project that he's been working on. Art Bell backs him and then begins to get money for him. And then the guy is like reporting on the progress, and he had other people coming, like other scientists working with him and other people coming because he now had the money for it. He had disappeared for a couple of years. Art didn't hear from him. He finally gets back to Art and says that he went through it, and he ended up 3 years earlier in like Des Moines, Iowa, when the experiments were taking place, in a totally different state. He ended up in Des Moines, Iowa 3 years earlier and has finally made it back. And then he began another experiment after that, and then disappeared again because he was very intent on going through it. But
Was he from Iowa?
I'm not sure if he was from Iowa.
So just a
We
random
really have to dig the
and
story up and like go through it because it's a fascinating story. But my point, like getting back to this, my point is that I believe you need enough power to fuel a city in order to do this, just as he was doing, if it's in fact true. But I believe that the power constraints are going to be huge on this kind of a thing.
that makes sense, because it takes energy in order to create these types of dimensional portals and things like that.
Right.
But man, wow, that's wild. I had no idea that this guy was on Art Bell,
Right. Yeah.
But
We'll
that
dig
sounds
him up and check it out.
totally. Well, hey, you guys at home, hope you've been enjoying this episode. What do you guys think about the Battle of LA? Are you staunch in your belief that it was really UFOs, or were we just looking at UFOs through some type of dimensional lens that was created by these radar, as John and his remote viewers have seen? What do you guys think? Please leave us a comment below. And click the link in the description to subscribe to the metaphysical.tv. The Mystery Junkie tier gets you access to all our exclusive video podcast episodes. Your support means we can keep doing these deep dives, and it also means we can design more merch and make more awesome products like our Metaphysical coffee, which you can get at the link in the description. John, thanks so much for being with us. And for those of you at home, we hope you thought this episode was as out of this world as we did.